There is a specific kind of exhaustion that settles into your bones when you have spent your entire life shrinking yourself so that someone else can feel tall. It does not happen overnight. It is a slow, methodical erasure, disguised as family loyalty, painted over with the brush of keeping the peace. My name is Emma Reed. If you're listening from somewhere far away, drop your city in the comments so I can see how far this has traveled. And please, stay with me until the end. I am 48 years old, and for as long as I can remember, I have been the invisible scaffolding holding up my family's crumbling facade. I learned early on that my achievements were only valuable if they did not cast a shadow over the golden child. That golden child was my younger brother, Logan. He is 38 now, 10 years my junior, but in my parents' eyes, he has always been the sun around which our entire family system orbits. The invitation that would ultimately destroy the fragile truce I had maintained with my family arrived on a Tuesday. It was late October, the kind of biting, wind-swept Boston afternoon that makes the sky look like bruised iron. I had just finished a grueling 14-hour shift at the hospital. As the chief medical officer and lead pediatric cardiothoracic surgeon at one of the most prestigious private medical centers on the East Coast, my days were measured not in hours, but in heartbeats. I had spent that morning reconstructing the tiny, fragile aortic arch of a 3-day-old infant. My shoulders ached, my eyes burned from the harsh glare of the surgical theater lights, and my hands, though perfectly steady under the microscope, felt heavy with the weight of the life I had just fought to keep in this world. I walked into my private office, a quiet sanctuary lined with medical journals, framed credentials I rarely looked at, and the quiet hum of the city filtering through the thick glass windows. I dropped my bag onto the leather sofa and walked over to my heavy mahogany desk. Resting perfectly in the center of my blotter was a thick, cream-colored envelope. It was the kind of stationery that demands attention. Heavy cardstock, blind embossed edges, and my address written in flawless, sweeping calligraphy. I recognized the return address immediately. It belonged to a high-end country club in the wealthiest suburb of the city, a place where memberships were inherited, not bought, and where the waitstaff wore white gloves and moved like ghosts. I picked up the silver letter opener my mentor had given me a decade ago and sliced through the wax seal. Inside was an invitation to an intimate engagement dinner. Logan was finally officially introducing his fiancée, Miley Vance, to our family. I stared at the thick gold foil of the lettering. I had heard about Miley for months. She was 32, brilliant, and by all accounts, genuinely kind. But more importantly to my brother and my parents, she was a Vance. Her father, Arthur Vance, was a billionaire titan in the healthcare investment sector. The Vances were old money, the kind of family that built hospital wings and endowed university libraries. For a man like Logan, a mid-level medical device sales director whose entire life was an exercise in projecting a wealth and status he did not actually possess, marrying Miley was not just a union of hearts. It was the ultimate acquisition. It was his golden ticket into a world he had desperately clawed at for his entire adult life. I felt a mild sense of relief. At least the date was a Friday evening I actually had off. I placed the invitation on my desk and reached for my phone to send him a brief congratulatory text. But as the screen illuminated, I saw that I already had a missed call and 2 unread messages from him. The first message was an image attachment, a digital copy of the same invitation sitting on my desk. The second message, sent 3 minutes later, was a block of text that made the air in my quiet office suddenly feel very thin. It read, "Hey, you probably just got the invite. Listen, this dinner is a massive deal for me. Miley's parents are going to be there, and Arthur Vance is incredibly old school and easily intimidated by know-it-alls. He hates people who brag about their degrees. So, do me a huge favor. Dress plain, don't wear anything flashy or those expensive tailored suits you always wear to board meetings. And if anyone asks what you do, just tell them you do medical billing or data entry for a small clinic. Don't mention the surgeries. Don't mention the CMO title. Just keep it simple and stay in the background. This is my night. Do not ruin it by trying to prove you're smarter than everyone else in the room." I did not gasp. I did not throw my phone. I simply stood there in the quiet hum of my office, reading the words over and over again until the letters began to blur. Just tell them you do medical billing or data entry. Some insults are thrown in the heat of an argument, fueled by sudden anger and meant to sting in the moment. But this was premeditated. This was a calculated, deliberate erasure of my entire existence. It was a request delivered with the casual cruelty of someone who had never, not for one single second of his life, considered my humanity, let alone my dignity. I thought about the infant whose chest I had closed just hours ago. I thought about the decades of grueling study, the student loans I had paid off entirely on my own, the sleepless nights, the relentless pressure of holding human lives in my hands. I had bled for my career. I had sacrificed relationships, free time, and my own youth to become one of the best in my field. And my brother, a man whose greatest accomplishment was convincing people to buy pacemakers using golf course charm, was asking me to shrink myself down into a fictional, manageable, unremarkable version of a sister, simply because my reality made him feel insecure. He wanted to parade me as a dull, lowly clerk so that his own fragile ego could remain the tallest structure in the room. Before I could process the sheer audacity of the text, my phone vibrated in my hand. The screen flashed with my mother's name, Julia. I let it ring 3 times. I knew exactly what this call was. It was the reinforcement. It was the flanking maneuver my family always used when Logan wanted something unreasonable. I swiped the green button and brought the phone to my ear. "Hello, Mom." "Oh, good. You're not in surgery," she said, her voice bright, carrying that specific practice lilt she used whenever she was about to ask me to set myself on fire to keep her son warm. "Did you get Logan's invitation?" "I did," I said, my voice perfectly level. "I also got his text message." There was a half-second of silence on the line, the sound of a woman quickly recalculating her approach. "Right. Well, that's actually why I'm calling. He told me what he asked of you, and I just wanted to make sure you understood where he's coming from." "Where he's coming from?" I repeated flatly. "You mean asking a chief of surgery to pretend to be a data entry clerk?" "Oh, don't use that tone," my mother sighed, the bright lilt immediately dropping into a familiar register of annoyance. "You know how Logan is. He's under a tremendous amount of pressure right now. The Vances are, well, they are very important people, very wealthy. Logan just wants everything to go smoothly. He doesn't want any awkwardness." "Why would my actual profession cause awkwardness, Mom?" I asked, looking out the window at the darkening Boston skyline. I already knew the answer, but I wanted to hear her say it. I needed to hear her say it. "Because you can be very intimidating," she snapped, losing her patience. "You walk into a room and you take over. You use big medical terms. You talk about life and death, and frankly, it makes people uncomfortable. Logan is trying to impress his future father-in-law. Mr. Vance is a traditional man. He wants to see that Logan comes from a normal, grounded, humble family. If you go in there bragging about being a hotshot surgeon, it's just going to look like you're trying to upstage your brother at his own engagement dinner." I closed my eyes. The twisted logic of it was breathtaking. In my family's distorted reality, my success was an offensive weapon. My dedication to medicine was a character flaw, an act of arrogance designed specifically to make Logan look bad. "I don't brag, Mom. I literally just answer the question when people ask what I do for a living." "Well, for one night, you can just give a different answer," she insisted, her tone hardening into a demand. "Is it really that hard? Is your ego so massive that you can't just step back and let your brother have the spotlight for one single evening? He has worked so hard to get this girl, to get into this family. If you mess this up for him because of your pride, I will never forgive you. He has worked so hard to get this girl." The phrasing made me sick. It sounded like a business transaction, a hunter finally trapping a prized animal. "It isn't about pride, Mom," I said, my voice dropping to a quiet whisper that carried more weight than a shout. "It's about the fact that he is asking me to lie to his future in-laws about who I am. He is ashamed of me. You are asking me to agree to my own humiliation." "Oh, stop being so dramatic," she groaned, the familiar sound of her dismissing my feelings ringing in my ear. "No one is humiliating you. We are just asking you to be a team player. Just wear a simple dress, sit quietly, smile, and let Logan be the star. Just for a few hours. That's all. We are family. Family makes sacrifices." I looked down at the gold-foiled invitation. Family makes sacrifices. It was the mantra of my childhood. But the sacrifices only ever flowed in one direction. It was me skipping my college graduation because Logan had a minor league baseball tryout the same day. It was me quietly paying off my parents' second mortgage so they wouldn't lose the house, while they co-signed a loan for Logan's luxury sports car. It was a lifetime of me making myself smaller so my brother would never have to grow up. "Will you do it?" she pressed, her voice sharp and demanding. "I need to know that you aren't going to cause a scene." I stood in the silence of my office. For 38 years, Logan had gotten his way. For 48 years, my mother had enabled him. They expected me to argue, to be difficult, and then, ultimately, to cave. Because I always caved. because I had always believed that eventually, if I was good enough, accommodating enough, successful enough, they would finally look at me and be proud. But looking at that text message, feeling the exhaustion of a 14-hour surgery in my bones, something inside me finally snapped. It wasn't a loud, violent break. It was quiet. It felt like a rusted lock finally giving way, dropping heavy to the floor. The desperate, pleading girl who just wanted her family to love her vanished. In her place stood a 48-year-old woman who held lives in her hands, a woman who had clawed her way to the top of a brutal profession, a woman who was finally, utterly done. I didn't owe them my shadow anymore. "Okay, Mom," I said smoothly, my voice devoid of any emotion. "Tell Logan I won't wear anything flashy. Tell him I'll sit wherever he puts me, and I won't say a word about my medical career." I could hear her let out a massive sigh of relief. "Oh, thank you. I knew you'd see reason. This is going to be such a beautiful night. You'll see. It's best for everyone." "I'm sure it will be unforgettable," I replied. I hung up the phone before she could say another word. I didn't delete Logan's text. I took a screenshot of it, saving it to a secure folder in my phone. I didn't know what I was going to do yet, but I knew one thing with absolute crystalline certainty. I was going to that dinner. I was going to wear exactly what he wanted. I was going to sit exactly where he put me. I was going to play the role he had written for me perfectly. What my foolish, arrogant brother didn't realize was that when you force someone into a dark corner, you don't just hide them. You give them the perfect vantage point to watch the entire room, and you give them the perfect position to strike. If you were to look at a cross-section of my family's history, much like looking at the rings of a felled tree, you would not see a sudden, catastrophic event that tore us apart. You would see decades of microscopic rot. You would see a slow, deliberate pruning of one branch so that another could endlessly stretch toward the sun. In psychology, there is a term for children who grow up in the shadow of a sibling who demands all of the parent's oxygen. They call us glass children. We are looked right through. We are expected to be sturdy, self-cleaning, and completely transparent, existing only as a window through which our parents can admire their preferred child. For my mother, Julia, and my father, Ryan, that view was exclusively filled by Logan. It is a strange thing to realize that your parents do not actually like you, even if they claim to love you out of biological obligation. I was born first, a quiet, hyper-focused girl who learned early that the best way to avoid my mother's sharp temper and my father's cold indifference was to be perfect. I got straight A's. I ironed my own school uniforms. I never asked for help with my homework. I believed, with the naive desperation of a lonely child, that achievement was the currency I could use to buy their affection. Then, when I was 10 years old, Logan arrived. From the moment he drew his first breath, the dynamic in the Reed household was permanently cast in stone. Logan was a loud, demanding, endlessly charming boy. He didn't have to earn their love. It was poured over him like a waterfall. If I brought home a flawless report card, my father would barely look up from his newspaper, offering a clipped, "That's what you're supposed to do, Emma." If Logan managed to bring home a C- in middle school math, my mother would bake a cake and praise his creative mind that was simply too brilliant for standard testing. The disparity only grew sharper, more grotesque, as we aged. The memory that still sits at the base of my throat like a swallowed stone is my college graduation. It was May of 2000. I was 22 years old, graduating summa cum laude with a degree in pre-med biology from a rigorous university. I had worked 3 part-time jobs, tutoring, serving tables in a diner smelling of stale grease, and cataloging slides in a campus lab, just to afford my tuition, because my parents had explicitly told me there was no money left for my education. I had earned a full academic scholarship for the remainder, surviving on coffee and sheer willpower. I was chosen to give the valedictory address. When I mailed my parents the invitation, my mother called to tell me they could only stay for the morning ceremony. Why? Because Logan, who was 12 at the time, had a regional travel baseball tournament 3 states over. I remember standing on that stage in my heavy black robe, looking out at a sea of thousands of proud parents holding bouquets of flowers and wiping away tears. I delivered a speech about perseverance and the duty we owe to human life. When I finished, the auditorium erupted in applause. I scanned the folding chairs in the 4th row where my parents had been sitting. The seats were empty. They had slipped out halfway through my speech to beat the highway traffic so Logan wouldn't miss his warm-up pitches. I spent my college graduation dinner sitting alone in a campus cafeteria eating a stale turkey sandwich dressed in my regalia, realizing that no matter how high I climbed, they would always be looking down. As the years ground on, the emotional neglect metastasized into financial exploitation. Medical school and my subsequent surgical residency were a blur of sleep deprivation and brutal, relentless pressure. I lived in a tiny, drafty studio apartment where the radiator clanked all night. I ate vending machine crackers for dinner. I scrubbed into surgeries at 3 a.m., holding retractors until my fingers went numb, learning the fragile architecture of the human heart. I was building a life with my bare, blistered hands. Meanwhile, Logan was drifting through a state college that my parents were fully funding. He changed his major 4 times. He joined a fraternity that required exorbitant dues. He drove a brand new Jeep my father had co-signed for him. When he inevitably took 6 years to graduate with a generic business degree, my parents threw a lavish catered party for him, declaring him the future CEO of the family. But the future CEO did not want to work his way up. Logan wanted the corner office without ever sitting in the cubicle. He bounced from one glossy, hollow sales job to another, always chasing the illusion of wealth. He wore bespoke suits he couldn't afford. He bought rounds of expensive scotch for strangers at upscale hotel bars to project the image of a high roller. He was a master of the veneer, a man entirely constructed of smoke, mirrors, and aggressively whitened teeth. And when the smoke cleared, it was always Ryan and Julia who paid the bill. Or rather, they tried to, until they ran out of money. 7 years ago, when I was 41 and finally established as a top-tier attending surgeon, the house of cards collapsed. Logan had convinced our parents to leverage their home, the house I grew up in, to fund a revolutionary tech startup he was launching with some friends. He promised them a massive return on investment. Instead, he blew the funds on leasing a luxury downtown penthouse to entertain investors and leasing a silver Porsche to look the part. The startup imploded within 10 months. The bank came for my parents' house. I remember the phone call. My father, a man who had never once asked about my grueling days in the operating room, called me sobbing. They were 2 weeks away from foreclosure. They were going to be on the street. Logan, of course, was unreachable, having temporarily relocated to Miami to clear his head. I should have let them fall. Any rational therapist would have told me that rescuing them was just reinforcing the toxicity, but they were my parents. The ingrained, pathetic childhood urge to finally be the hero, to finally prove my worth, took over. I didn't just pay off the arrears. I bought them a beautiful, modest, single-story ranch house in a quiet, safe suburb. I paid for the movers. I set up a trust to cover their property taxes and utilities so they would never have to worry about a roof over their heads again. It cost me a massive portion of my hard-earned savings, money I had planned to use to open my own specialized pediatric clinic. When I handed them the keys, I didn't expect a parade, but I did expect gratitude. Instead, my mother walked through the lovely, sunlit living room, ran her finger over the granite countertop, and sighed. "It's very cozy, Emma," she said, the word cozy dripping with condescension. "But there's no formal dining room. Where is Logan going to entertain his clients when he comes to visit? You know he needs a space that reflects his caliber." My father chimed in, adjusting his glasses. "It will do for now. Logan assures us he's going to buy us a proper estate once his new venture takes off. He felt terrible about the old house, just terrible. He has such a soft heart, that boy. The stress of it all nearly broke him." I stood in the kitchen I had just purchased for them, completely invisible. I had handed them a lifeboat, and they were complaining about the color of the paint while praising the man who had drilled the hole in their sinking ship. From that day forward, something inside me calcified. I stopped trying to earn their love. I stopped sharing my milestones. When I was appointed chief medical officer at the hospital, a monumental achievement that broke a decades-long glass ceiling at the institution, I didn't even call them. I knew Julia would just find a way to make it about how Logan's job was much more stressful because sales is a dog-eat-dog world. Logan, for his part, began to genuinely believe the mythology our parents had built around him. He believed he was a self-made titan temporarily down on his luck. When he finally landed his current job as a sales director for a medical device company, a job he only got because of his slick charm and aggressive networking, he immediately inflated his lifestyle again. He bought a Rolex on credit. He started frequenting the country clubs where the old money elites of Boston spent their weekends. And that is where he met Miley Vance. Miley was everything Logan wanted to be. Effortlessly wealthy, socially impeccable, and insulated by a billionaire father. To Logan, Miley wasn't just a woman to love. She was a golden ladder out of his middle-class reality. But to climb that ladder, he had to make sure the Vances believed he belonged on it. He spun a web of lies about our family. He painted himself as the industrious, brilliant son of a respectable, quiet family. But I was the wild card. I was the glaring inconsistency in his carefully curated lie. I didn't fit the narrative of the quiet, unremarkable sister who looked up to her wealthy brother. I was a prominent surgeon. I dealt with hospital board members, federal health regulators, and multi-million-dollar budgets every single day. I existed in a world that Logan was desperately trying to fake his way into. He knew that if Arthur Vance, a man renowned for his sharp intellect and deep respect for the medical field, spent 5 minutes talking to me, Logan's flimsy facade of superiority would disintegrate. He knew I was the one person in the room who could effortlessly outshine him just by answering the question, "What do you do?" Sitting in my office, watching the city lights flicker to life against the dark Boston sky, I looked down at my phone again. The screen was dark, but Logan's words were burned into my retinas. Just tell them you do medical billing or data entry. Don't mention the surgeries. He was not just asking me to lie. He was trying to permanently edit me out of my own life story. He wanted me to strip away every hour of study, every life I had saved, every ounce of respect I had commanded in the operating room, and compress myself into a tiny, pathetic box, all so he could stand on top of it and look taller. I tapped the screen of my phone, opening the group chat with my mother and brother. I typed a single, simple sentence. I will be there on Friday. I'll wear the black dress from last year, and I'll keep a low profile. I hit send. The silence in my office was profound. I didn't feel angry anymore. Anger is a hot, chaotic emotion. What I felt was entirely different. It was the icy, absolute precision of a surgeon standing over an operating table, identifying a mass that has been poisoning the body for years and finally picking up the scalpel to cut it out. I was going to that dinner. I was going to be exactly the sister Logan demanded, and I was going to let him dig his own grave right in front of the very people he worshipped. The next morning, the sterile, bright lights of the hospital felt strangely comforting. In the operating room, there is no ambiguity. A heart is either beating or it is not. A vessel is either repaired or it bleeds. There are no illusions, no manicured facades, no lies told to impress billionaires. There is only the brutal, honest truth of human anatomy. I had just scrubbed out of a complex valve replacement and was sitting in the doctor's lounge, staring blankly at a lukewarm cup of black coffee. My phone sat face up on the table. Logan's text message was still pulled up on the screen. Just tell them you do medical billing or data entry. I hadn't realized I was gripping the edge of the table until a sharp, commanding voice broke through my thoughts. If you squeeze that table any harder, Emma, you're going to need an orthopedic consult for your own hands. I looked up. Standing in the doorway was Dr. Sarah Hayes. Sarah was a legend in Boston's medical community. At 65, she was the former chief of surgery, the woman who had personally mentored me, fought for my promotions, and taught me how to navigate a hospital board dominated by men with fragile egos. She was sharp as a scalpel, elegant in a terrifying way, and possessed a bullshit detector that was famously accurate. She walked over, her white coat billowing slightly, and took the seat across from me. "You look like you're planning a murder," Sarah noted mildly, sipping from her own travel mug, or at least a very aggressive malpractice suit. "What is it?" I let out a slow, tired breath. I rarely spoke about my family to my colleagues. My professional life was my sanctuary, the one place where I was defined by my capabilities rather than my birth order. But Sarah was different. She had been there the night my parents skipped my award ceremony to help Logan pick out apartment furniture. She knew the shape of the ghost that haunted my personal life. Without a word, I slid my phone across the table. Sarah picked it up. She adjusted her reading glasses, her eyes scanning the glowing screen. For a long moment, the lounge was completely silent, save for the hum of the vending machine in the corner. I watched Sarah's expression. She didn't gasp. She didn't shake her head in disbelief. Instead, her face went perfectly, terrifyingly still. The corners of her mouth tightened into a microscopic line. When she finally looked up, her eyes were the color of winter ice. "Medical billing," Sarah repeated, her voice dropping an octave. "For a small clinic," I added dryly. "Don't forget the small clinic part. He wants to make sure I sound appropriately insignificant." "Emma," Sarah said, placing the phone face down on the table as if it were contaminated, "tell me you are not actually going to entertain this spectacular display of narcissism." "I am going," I said quietly, "and I am going to do exactly what he asked." And Sarah's brow furrowed. "Why on earth would you agree to humiliate yourself for a boy who wouldn't cross the street to hand you a glass of water if you were on fire?" Because, Sarah, I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table. If I argue, I'm the villain. If I refuse to go, I'm the bitter, jealous older sister trying to ruin his big night. My mother will cry. My father will call me selfish. Logan will spin a narrative that I couldn't handle his success. I paused, letting the reality of my family's twisted dynamics settle between us. But if I go, if I sit exactly where he puts me, and I wear what he wants me to wear, and I play the role of the invisible, unremarkable sister. Sarah's eyes narrowed as she caught the thread of my logic. You let him build his house of cards right in front of the Vances. Exactly. He wants to lie to Arthur Vance. He wants to build his marriage on a foundation of absolute fraud. And I picked up my coffee, though I had no intention of drinking it. Logan has spent his whole life insulated from the consequences of his actions because my parents always bailed him out. But they can't bail him out of this. Not if he does it to himself, in public, in front of a man who values integrity above all else. Sarah sat back in her chair, a slow, predatory smile spreading across her face. Arthur Vance, she mused, tapping her manicured fingernail against her coffee mug. Your brother is engaged to Miley Vance? Yes. Do you know them? Emma, everyone at a certain level in the city knows Arthur, Sarah said, a wicked gleam in her eye. He is one of the primary benefactors of our pediatric research wing. He is a fiercely protective, terrifyingly observant man. He does not suffer fools, and he absolutely despises social climbers. Sarah stood up, smoothing the front of her tailored trousers. She picked up my phone, handed it back to me, and gave me a look that brokered zero argument. You are not going to this dinner alone, she declared. Sarah, I don't have a +1, and even if I did, Logan would lose his mind if I brought... I am your +1, Sarah interrupted smoothly, and frankly, I don't care if your brother loses his mind. I am a senior board member of a hospital that Arthur Vance heavily funds. If I walk into that country club, your brother will not have the spine to ask me to leave, and I would not miss this car crash for anything in the world. I looked at my mentor. For the first time in days, a genuine knot of tension in my chest began to loosen. Are you sure? It's going to be incredibly uncomfortable. My dear, Sarah smiled, a cold, brilliant expression. I have spent 30 years cutting open chests and stopping human hearts. I eat uncomfortable for breakfast, wear the black dress, the boring one, the one that makes you look like you file paperwork for a living? The crepe wool one? I asked, picturing the most conservative, understated garment in my closet. Perfect, Sarah said, turning toward the door. Let them underestimate you, Emma. It makes the autopsy so much cleaner. When Friday evening arrived, I stood in front of my bedroom mirror. I had followed Logan's instructions to the letter. I wore a plain, high-necked black dress that fell below my knees. No jewelry, save for a simple watch. I pulled my hair back into a severe, practical knot at the nape of my neck. I wore flats. Looking at my reflection, I looked exactly like the woman Logan wanted me to be. Tired, invisible, easily dismissed. A woman whose life was entirely unremarkable. I slipped my phone into my small clutch. I didn't feel nervous. The trembling anxiety that used to accompany family events, the desperate hope that this time, maybe this time, they would treat me with respect was completely gone. I was walking into a trap, yes. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't the prey. I walked out the door, the cool autumn wind hitting my face, ready to let my brother burn his own world down. The drive to the Beacon Hill Country Club was a masterclass in quiet anticipation. Dr. Sarah Hayes drove a meticulously maintained charcoal gray Lexus, a car that whispered wealth rather than shouting it. The autumn leaves swirled against the windshield as we wound our way through the manicured wrought iron gates of the estate. The club itself was an imposing structure of ivy-covered brick and slate, radiating the kind of exclusionary warmth that only generational wealth can buy. The driveway was a parade of black town cars, sleek European sedans, and valet attendants moving with choreographed efficiency. I looked down at my hands, resting in the lap of my severe, unadorned black crepe dress. I wore no rings, no watch, no necklace. Beside me, Sarah was dressed in a tailored navy pantsuit that fit her with terrifying perfection. A silk scarf draped effortlessly over one shoulder. She looked like exactly what she was. A woman who governed rooms just by breathing in them. How is your heart rate, Emma? Sarah asked, not taking her eyes off the sweeping driveway as she pulled to a stop behind a Bentley. A steady 60 beats per minute, I replied dryly. Surgeon's resting pulse. Good. Sarah shifted the car into park and handed the keys to a waiting valet without looking at him. Remember the golden rule of dealing with a narcissist, Emma? Never interrupt them when they are making a mistake. Let him dig. You just hold the shovel. We stepped into the grand foyer, and the scent of the place hit me instantly. Beeswax polish, expensive floral arrangements, and the faint, crisp smell of wood smoke from a massive stone fireplace. A string quartet was playing something classical and unobtrusive in the corner. The floors were polished marble, reflecting the warm glow of crystal chandeliers. I handed my modest wool coat to the coat check attendant, taking a steadying breath. Through the grand mahogany double doors, the private dining room opened up before us. It was a space designed for opulence, featuring floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the darkened, rolling hills of the golf course. My eyes immediately scanned the room and found them. The main table was an expansive oval situated perfectly in the center of the room, draped in heavy white linen and adorned with towering centerpieces of white orchids and hydrangeas. And there, standing at the head of the table holding a crystal flute of champagne, was my brother. Logan looked like a spread from a GQ magazine. He was wearing a bespoke midnight blue tuxedo that I knew, with absolute certainty, he had put on a credit card he couldn't afford to pay off. His hair was perfectly styled, his smile wide and gleaming. He was holding court, gesturing animatedly as he spoke to a distinguished, silver-haired man I instantly recognized from hospital board meetings and donor galas, Arthur Vance. Beside Logan stood Miley, radiant in an understated emerald silk dress, her hand resting affectionately on his arm. To their left, my parents, Ryan and Julia, were hovering. My mother was wearing a dress that was trying far too hard to look expensive, her posture stiff with the desperate effort of appearing to belong. My father was nodding too vigorously at whatever Arthur Vance was saying, holding his drink with both hands like a shield. "Look at them," Sarah murmured softly beside me, her eyes tracking the family dynamic with clinical precision. "They look like a community theater troupe trying to perform Shakespeare." Before I could respond, Logan shifted his weight and his eyes caught mine across the crowded room. Even from 50 feet away, I saw the micro-expressions flicker across his face. First, a flash of relief. He saw the plain black dress. He saw the scraped back hair. He saw the absolute lack of threat in my physical appearance. I had followed his instructions to the letter. I looked like a tired, unremarkable data entry clerk. But then, his eyes shifted a fraction of an inch to my right, and he saw Sarah. Confusion washed over his features, quickly followed by a sharp, panicked tension. Logan didn't know who Sarah was. He had never bothered to attend any of my hospital functions, never asked about my colleagues. But he possessed the predatory instinct of a social climber. He could smell authority. He saw the cut of Sarah's suit, the posture, the undeniable aura of a woman who belonged in rooms exactly like this one. She was a variable he had not controlled for. I watched him lean over to Miley, whisper something in her ear, and kiss her cheek. Then he detached himself from the Vances and began moving toward us. He didn't walk. He stalked, his smile plastered on his face, but his eyes hard and calculating. "Emma," Logan said as he reached us, stepping directly into my personal space to block my view of the main table. His voice was hushed, carrying a frantic, vibrating energy. "You're here. Good." He looked me up and down, a brief nod of approval at my dowdy appearance, before turning his sharp gaze to Sarah. "And who is this?" "This is Sarah," I said, my voice perfectly level. "She gave me a ride. I brought her as my +1. Logan's smile tightened into a grimace. "I didn't give you a +1, Emma. This is a highly curated, intimate family dinner. The seating chart is exact." "I can easily leave, Logan," I offered, making a slight movement to turn back toward the foyer. "If it's too much trouble." "No," he hissed, his hand shooting out to grip my forearm. The grip was a fraction too tight, a physical warning. He couldn't risk me leaving and drawing attention, nor could he risk our mother having a meltdown. He let go, smoothing his lapels. "No, it's fine. It's fine. I'll make it work. Just come with me, quickly, before the Vances sit down." He didn't introduce himself to Sarah. He didn't offer to take her coat. He simply turned his back and expected us to follow. He led us away from the glittering center of the room, away from the soaring windows and the orchids. We walked past the secondary tables reserved for extended family and close friends. We kept walking until the thick, plush carpet gave way to the edge of the hardwood flooring near the back wall. "Here," Logan said, stopping abruptly. I looked at where he was pointing. It was a tiny square table, easily half the size of the others. It was shoved into the darkest corner of the room, directly adjacent to the heavy wooden swinging doors that led to the kitchen. There was no floral centerpiece, only a single sad tea light flickering in a cheap glass votive. The tablecloth was noticeably creased. It was a table meant for vendors, the wedding planner, or the overflow staff. It was a table designed to be invisible. Every time the kitchen doors swung open, a harsh draft of industrial air and the clatter of dishwashing spilled out over the chairs. There was a last-minute shuffle with the catering staff. Logan lied smoothly, not meeting my eyes. This was the only place left. You don't mind, do you? Since you prefer to keep a low profile anyway. It was a masterstroke of cruelty. He wasn't just hiding me, he was physically subjugating me. He was putting me in my place. I looked at the table, then up at my brother. His jaw was clenched. He was waiting for the fight. He was waiting for me to act like the difficult, arrogant older sister so he could sigh, play the victim, and justify his actions to his future wife. I offered him a soft, compliant smile. It's perfectly fine, Logan. It's very quiet back here. He blinked, clearly thrown by my lack of resistance. Right, good. Just sit tight. Dinner starts in 20 minutes. Don't wander around the main table. The servers need the pathways clear. With that final directive, he turned on his heel and hurried back to the light, rejoining the billionaire family he was desperately trying to infiltrate. Sarah and I took our seats. As I pulled my chair in, a waiter burst through the swinging doors with a tray of empty glasses, the heavy wood grazing the back of my chair. Well, Sarah said, picking up her linen napkin and draping it over her lap with elegant precision. I must say, the ambiance here is breathtaking. I can really feel the deep, unconditional sibling love. I told you, I murmured, watching my parents across the room. My mother was laughing, a high, reedy sound, as Arthur Vance's wife, Eleanor, politely listened. They need me small. Small is one thing, Emma. This is an attempted burial, Sarah noted. She signaled a passing waiter, not by waving, but with a subtle, authoritative flick of her wrist that instantly brought the young man to our table. 2 glasses of your best Pinot Noir, please. The reserve. Right away, ma'am, the waiter said, practically bowing. We sat in the shadows, sipping our water, watching the room. 10 minutes later, I saw Logan whisper something to Miley, gesturing vaguely in our direction. Miley nodded, a look of sympathetic resolve crossing her face, and began to weave her way through the tables toward our dark corner. She was beautiful up close, with kind, intelligent eyes. She didn't possess the sharp edges of someone who had to fight for her wealth. She had the soft grace of someone who had always been safe. Hi, Miley said warmly as she reached our table. You must be Emma. I'm Miley. I am so incredibly happy to finally meet you. She extended her hand. I stood up slightly and shook it. Her grip was firm and genuine. It's wonderful to meet you too, Miley. Congratulations on the engagement. Thank you. Miley glanced around the cramped table, a fleeting look of discomfort crossing her features as a draft from the kitchen ruffled her silk dress. I am so sorry about the seating. Logan told me the venue messed up the head count and this was the only solution. If I had known, I would have squeezed you in at the main table. Don't worry about it, I said smoothly. I don't mind the quiet. Miley offered a soft, almost pitying smile. It was the kind of smile you give to someone who is recovering from a long illness. It instantly confirmed my suspicions. Logan had fed her a specific, tragic narrative about me. Logan talks about you, Miley said, keeping her voice low as if we were discussing a sensitive diagnosis. He told me how hard you work, doing all that medical data entry and billing. It must be so exhausting staring at screens all day, dealing with all that paperwork. Beside me, Sarah took a slow, deliberate sip of her water, her eyes fixed on Miley. It can be very demanding, I agreed, my tone polite and entirely unbothered. It requires a lot of precision. In my line of work, if you make a mistake, the consequences are incredibly severe. So I have to be very careful with the details. I can imagine, Miley said earnestly. Logan said you've had a rough go of things lately and that you get overwhelmed in large crowds. I just wanted to come over and make sure you were comfortable. If it gets too loud or if you need to step outside, please don't hesitate. The sheer magnitude of the lie hit me like a physical weight. A rough go of things. Gets overwhelmed. He hadn't just made me a clerk, he had made me a fragile, unstable liability. He had painted himself as the protective, long-suffering brother managing his defective older sister. I appreciate your concern, Miley, I said, my voice steady, but I assure you I am perfectly fine. I actually handle high-pressure situations very well. I'm glad to hear that, she said, squeezing my arm lightly. Logan is just so protective of his family. He wants everything to be perfect tonight. She finally looked over at Sarah. Oh, I'm sorry, I'm Miley. Sarah Hayes, Sarah said, extending her hand. She didn't offer a title. She didn't explain her presence. It's lovely to meet you, Sarah. Thank you for keeping Emma company. Miley gave us one last warm smile before turning back toward the brightly lit center of the room, returning to her fiancé. I watched her walk away. She was a good person. She was walking blindfolded into a marriage with a man who was entirely fabricated. He told her you were fragile, Sarah observed quietly, her voice devoid of its usual sharp humor. It was cold now. He made you a charity case to earn sympathy points from his wealthy bride. Yes, I said, staring at the flickering tea light on our table. Emma, Sarah said, leaning slightly closer. I was prepared to sit here and let him look like a fool, but this is pathological. I know. Are you ready to stop playing dead? I looked across the room. The servers were beginning to pour the champagne for the first toast. My father was laughing. My mother was adjusting Logan's lapel. Logan was standing tall, looking over the room as if he owned it. He looked toward our corner one last time, saw me sitting quietly in the shadows, and turned away, completely satisfied that the threat had been neutralized. Then, at the head of the main table, Arthur Vance stood up. He didn't tap his glass. He didn't ask for attention. Men with that much power rarely have to ask for a room to quiet down. Their movement alone commands silence. He picked up his champagne flute and whispered something to his wife, Eleanor, who smiled and nodded. Instead of raising his glass from where he stood, Arthur Vance stepped away from the main table. He began a slow, deliberate walk around the room, making his way to each of the secondary tables to personally greet the extended family members and friends before the first course was served. It was an old-school gesture of respect, a hallmark of the old money elite. He shook hands. He offered quiet words of thanks. He was closing the distance, moving methodically from table to table, working his way toward the back of the room. Sarah reached across the small, wobbly table and placed her hand lightly over my wrist. Her eyes were sharp, bright, and utterly ruthless. Here we go, she whispered. I sat up a little straighter in my cheap chair, folded my hands in my lap, and waited for the billionaire to reach the shadows. The room was a symphony of clinking silver and low, cultured laughter. I watched Arthur Vance move from table to table with the effortless grace of a man who had never been told he didn't belong somewhere. He possessed an imposing, quiet authority. He shook hands, he nodded, he offered brief, personalized remarks that made the recipients glow with sudden, desperate pride. At the main table, my brother Logan was practically vibrating with triumph. He stood with one hand casually tucked into his tuxedo pocket, playing the role of the aristocratic groom-to-be to absolute perfection. My parents, Ryan and Julia, were beaming, completely entranced by the proximity to such staggering wealth. They didn't look back at my corner once. To them, the problem had been handled. I was out of sight, and therefore, out of mind. Arthur Vance finished speaking to a table of Logan's former fraternity brothers. He turned, adjusting the grip on his crystal champagne flute, and began walking toward the final table in the room. Our table. The cramped, drafty square shoved against the swinging kitchen doors. Beside me, Sarah took a slow, deliberate sip of her water. She didn't say a word, but the slight, predatory tilt of her chin told me she was entirely ready for the collision. I remained perfectly still in my cheap folding chair, my hands folded over the plain, black crepe of my dress. I didn't shrink away. I didn't avert my gaze. I looked directly at the billionaire as he approached the shadows. It happened when he was about 10 feet away. Arthur Vance had a polite, practiced smile on his face, the kind of smile reserved for obligatory introductions to distant relatives. He stepped into the dim lighting of our corner, and his eyes met mine. The polite smile didn't just fade. It vanished instantly. He stopped walking. It was an abrupt physical halt, as if he had hit an invisible wall of glass. His silver eyebrows drew together, his gaze locking onto my face with a sudden, intense sharpness. He blinked once, hard, as if his brain was struggling to process the impossible contradiction of what his eyes were seeing. I knew exactly what he was seeing, because I knew exactly what I meant to him. 10 years ago, on a freezing Tuesday at 3 a.m., the emergency department pages went out. A catastrophic rupture of an aortic aneurysm. The patient was a 52-year-old woman. 3 other senior surgeons had looked at the scans and declared her inoperable. They said she would bleed out on the table before they could even clamp the artery. They told the husband to say his goodbyes. I was 38 then. I hadn't listened to them. I scrubbed in, walked into the operating theater, and for the next 14 hours, I fought a brutal, bloody war against human mortality. I held Eleanor Vance's heart in my bare hands while the bypass machine hummed, stitching microscopic tears in the very fabric of her life. When I finally walked out into the waiting room, my scrub soaked in sweat, it was Arthur Vance who stood up, his face gray with terror. When I told him she was going to live, the billionaire had collapsed into a hospital chair and wept into his hands. Since that day, our paths had crossed professionally. He funded my research. He sat on the board that approved my promotion to chief medical officer. We maintained a deep, abiding mutual respect. But out of context, stripped of my white coat, dressed like a dowdy clerk, and shoved into the staff overflow corner, it took his brain a fraction of a second to reconcile the image. When it did, the reaction was visceral. The crystal champagne flute slipped from Arthur Vance's fingers. It hit the hardwood floor with a sharp, violent crash. Shards of expensive glass exploded outward, and pale gold liquid splashed across the polished wood. The sound acted like a gunshot in the serene, muffled elegance of the country club. The string quartet in the corner fumbled to a jarring halt. Conversations died mid-sentence. Heads snapped around. Within 3 seconds, a suffocating, absolute silence fell over the entire dining room. Across the room, Logan physically jumped. The smug, triumphant smile slid off his face, replaced instantly by a look of sheer panic. He saw Arthur staring at my table, and I could practically see the gears grinding in my brother's head, desperately trying to figure out how his invisible sister had somehow offended his future father-in-law. Arthur didn't look down at the broken glass. He didn't look back at the room. He took 2 large, rapid steps forward, completely ignoring the spilled champagne soaking into the leather of his expensive shoes. He stopped directly in front of my tiny, wobbly table. And then, the patriarch of the Vance family, a man who intimidated senators and CEOs, did something that made the air in the room turn to ice. He bowed his head, a gesture of profound, undeniable reverence. "Dr. Reed," Arthur said. His voice was not loud, but in the dead silence of the room, it carried like thunder. It was thick with emotion and absolute shock. "My God, Dr. Emma Reed, is it really you?" I offered him a calm, measured smile. I didn't stand up. I simply looked at him and said, "Hello, Arthur. It is wonderful to see you. Eleanor is looking radiant tonight." Arthur exhaled a breath that sounded like a laugh of pure disbelief. He reached across the small table and grasped both of my hands in his, gripping them tightly. "She is radiant because of you, Emma. Every day I have with her is because of you." He held my hands for another moment, his eyes shining with gratitude, before reality seemed to snap back into focus. He looked around the table. He looked at the flickering, cheap tea light. He looked at the heavy wooden swinging doors of the kitchen just inches from my chair. He felt the cold draft of the service hallway. His expression hardened instantly, transforming from overwhelming gratitude to a terrifying, quiet fury. "Emma," Arthur demanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous, icy register, "what in the hell are you doing sitting back here by the service entrance?" Before I could answer, hurried footsteps echoed across the hardwood. Logan was practically sprinting across the room, his face flushed a deep, panicked red. Miley was close behind him, looking confused and concerned. "Arthur! Arthur, I'm so sorry!" Logan babbled, out of breath, his hands waving in a desperate attempt to defuse a bomb he didn't even understand. He stepped between us, trying to physically block Arthur's view of me. "There was a spill. I apologize. The waiters will clean it up. Please, let's go back to the main table." Arthur did not move. He slowly turned his head to look at my brother. The billionaire's eyes were flat and unreadable. "Logan," Arthur said, his tone ominously calm, "do you know this woman?" Logan swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. He looked at me, his eyes pleading, begging me to play the role he had assigned me, the data entry clerk, the fragile, broken sister. "Yes, sir," Logan stammered, his voice tight. That's just my sister, Emma. Like I mentioned, she does administrative work. She gets overwhelmed easily, so we thought it was best she sat near the back, out of the way." Beside me, Sarah let out a soft, sharp sound that was half laugh, half scoff. Arthur Vance stared at Logan for 5 excruciating seconds. He didn't blink. The silence stretched so tight it felt like it was going to snap. Across the room, I saw my mother clutching my father's arm, her face pale with the sudden, terrifying realization that the script had been ripped to shreds. "Administrative work," Arthur repeated slowly, tasting the words as if they were poison. He turned his gaze to Miley, who was staring at Logan with a bewildered expression. Then, Arthur looked back at my brother, and the patrician restraint finally broke. "Are you out of your mind?" Arthur's voice boomed, echoing off the high ceilings. He pointed a long, steady finger directly at me. "This woman does not do administrative work. This woman is the chief medical officer at Boston General. She is the lead pediatric cardiothoracic surgeon in this state. 10 years ago, when the best doctors in this city told me to plan my wife's funeral, this woman stood in an operating room for 14 hours and gave the mother of your fiancé her life back." Miley let out a sharp gasp, her hands flying to her mouth. She looked at me, then slowly, horrifyingly, turned to look at the man she was supposed to marry. Logan stood frozen, his mouth slightly open, all the blood draining from his face until he looked like a corpse in a tailored tuxedo. Arthur took a step closer to Logan, his voice dropping into a deadly, quiet hiss that somehow felt louder than a shout. "She is a titan in her field. She is a savior to my family. And you? You sat her in the shadows by the dishwashers and told my daughter she was a fragile clerk to hide her?" Logan tried to speak. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. His entire fabricated universe, the foundation of lies he had spent months building to secure his golden ticket, was incinerating right in front of his eyes. Arthur Vance didn't wait for an answer. He turned his back on my brother, dismissing him entirely, and looked down at me. "Dr. Reed," he said, extending his arm. "Please. There is an empty chair next to me at the head of the table. I would be profoundly honored if you would join us." I looked at Arthur's outstretched hand. I looked at Logan's pale, terrified face. And then I looked at Sarah, who was sitting back in her chair, watching the destruction with the serene satisfaction of an architect watching a controlled demolition. The silence in the dining room was no longer just the absence of noise. It possessed a physical weight. It pressed down on the tables, suffocating the ambient hum of the country club until the only sound was the frantic, shallow breathing of my brother. Arthur Vance stood before my wobbly table, his hand outstretched, offering me the seat of honor that Logan had spent his entire life trying to steal. I looked at Arthur's hand. Then I looked past him to where my parents were frozen near the centerpieces. My mother, Julia, had a hand clamped over her mouth, her eyes wide with the terror of a woman watching her greatest investment plunge to zero. My father, Ryan, was staring at the floor, suddenly fascinated by the Persian rug, retreating into the cowardly silence he had perfected over 4 decades. I slowly stood up. I did not take Arthur's hand. Instead, I offered him a warm, steady smile. "Arthur, your invitation is incredibly generous," I said, my voice carrying effortlessly across the room. "But I must decline. Logan was very specific about the seating chart. He placed me here by the kitchen doors for a reason. And as my mother reminded me before I arrived, tonight is about supporting my brother's vision for his future." Arthur dropped his hand. He didn't look offended. He looked like a man who was rapidly solving a very dark, very complex puzzle. Logan, completely misreading my calmness as an opportunity for salvation, scrambled forward. He let out a breathless, jagged laugh that sounded like tearing metal. "Right, yes, exactly," Logan stammered, his eyes darting wildly between Arthur and me. He smoothed his hands over the lapels of his tuxedo, a nervous tic he'd had since childhood. "Mr. Vance, Arthur, please. This is all just a giant misunderstanding." Emma is incredibly modest, painfully modest, really. She hates talking about her work. She hates the spotlight. When we were planning the dinner, she practically begged me to let her sit in the back so she wouldn't have to answer questions about the hospital. You know how intense her job is. She just wanted a quiet night. It was a masterful pivot. In a matter of seconds, Logan was attempting to reframe his cruelty as an act of protective, loving accommodation. He was trying to cast himself as the dutiful brother who was only shielding his introverted sister from the exhausting demands of high society. Arthur Vance did not move. He tilted his head, his silver hair catching the light of the chandelier, and stared at Logan. "She begged you to sit by the dishwashers?" "Well, not the dishwashers, obviously." Logan swallowed, sweat beginning to bead at his hairline despite the cool draft from the kitchen. "But the back of the room. I was just honoring her wishes. We didn't want to make a big deal out of who she is. I didn't want anyone feeling intimidated. We just wanted the focus to be on Miley." Logan reached out and gently grabbed Miley's hand, trying to pull her into his orbit, trying to use her as a human shield. Miley stood rigid, her eyes fixed on me, her mind clearly racing backward through months of conversations. Before Arthur could dismantle Logan's pathetic excuse, the chair beside me scraped against the hardwood floor. Dr. Sarah Hayes stood up, She didn't rush. She smoothed the front of her navy silk suit, picked up her water glass, took a measured sip, and then turned her terrifying, icy gaze toward the billionaire. "Arthur," Sarah said, her voice dripping with patrician elegance. "It has been far too long since the last hospital board gala." Arthur Vance turned, his eyes narrowing for a fraction of a second before widening in immediate recognition. The heavy, threatening posture he had assumed toward Logan softened slightly into professional respect. "Dr. Hayes, good God, I didn't even see you sitting in the dark. What on earth are you doing back here?" "I am Emma's +1, Sarah replied smoothly, stepping out from behind the small table. "And I must say, as a former chief of surgery and a current sitting board member, the view from the service entrance is incredibly illuminating. You get to see exactly how the sausage is made." Logan's face drained of whatever color was left. He stared at Sarah, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. He hadn't just insulted a surgeon. He had insulted two of the most powerful medical figures in New England, placing them both at a folding table next to the trash bins. "Sarah," Arthur said, his voice dropping an octave, "what is going on here?" "What is going on, Arthur, is that this young man is currently lying to your face," Sarah said, gesturing toward Logan with the casual flick of her wrist, as if she were pointing out a stain on the carpet. "And he is doing it with the kind of sloppy desperation that I usually only see from first-year residents who have accidentally punctured a lung." "Wait, hold on, that's not—" Logan started, taking a step toward Sarah, his voice rising in panic. "Do not interrupt me," Sarah snapped, her voice cracking like a whip. Logan snapped his mouth shut, instinctively submitting to the sheer authority radiating from her. Sarah turned to me, her expression perfectly calm. "Emma, dear, would you mind unlocking your phone for a moment?" I knew exactly what she was doing. I didn't hesitate. I reached into my small black clutch, pulled out my phone, unlocked the screen, and handed it to her. The screenshot of Logan's text message was already pulled up, glowing brightly in the dim corner. Sarah took the phone, adjusted her reading glasses, and looked at Arthur Vance. Then she looked directly at Miley. "Emma did not beg to sit in the shadows," Sarah stated, her voice carrying clear and sharp to every corner of the dining room. "Every guest, every waiter, every family member was hanging on her next word. Emma is sitting here because your fiancé sent her a set of instructions. Allow me to read them to you." "No, Emma, don't let her do this, my mother," Julia suddenly shrieked from across the room, finally breaking her terrified silence. She practically lunged forward, her high heels clicking frantically on the marble floor as she rushed toward us. "Arthur, please, it's just sibling rivalry. Logan was just nervous. Emma has always been jealous of him. She's trying to ruin his night." Arthur Vance turned his head, fixing my mother with a glare so cold it stopped her dead in her tracks 10 feet away. "Mrs. Reed," he said, his voice dangerously soft, "if you take one more step, I will have security remove you from this building. Let the doctor speak." My mother froze, her face crumpling into a mask of humiliated terror. She looked at Logan, who was staring at the floor, trembling. Sarah didn't even blink at the interruption. She looked down at the glowing screen of my phone. "Sent at 4:12 p.m. on Tuesday," Sarah began, reading the text with a slow, deliberate cadence that made every word hit like a hammer. "Listen, this dinner is a massive deal for me. Miley's parents are going to be there, and Arthur Vance is easily intimidated by know-it-alls. He hates people who brag about their degrees." Arthur let out a low, humorless scoff. Sarah continued mercilessly. "So, do me a huge favor. Dress plain, don't wear anything flashy. And if anyone asks what you do, just tell them you do medical billing or data entry for a small clinic. Don't mention the surgeries. Don't mention the CMO title. Just keep it simple and stay in the background. This is my night. Do not ruin it by trying to prove you're smarter than everyone else in the room." Sarah finished reading. She pressed the lock button on the phone, the screen going black, and handed it back to me. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a bomb detonating, leaving nothing but a vacuum in its wake. Logan looked like he was going to vomit. His pristine posture had completely collapsed. He looked small, pathetic, and entirely exposed. The bespoke tuxedo suddenly looked like a costume he had stolen. "Easily intimidated by know-it-alls," Arthur repeated slowly, tasting the profound insult of the words. He looked at Logan, and the disgust in his eyes was absolute. "You thought I would be intimidated by the woman who saved my wife's life? You thought I was a man so fragile, so pathetic, that I would demand a brilliant surgeon hide her accomplishments to stroke my ego? No, sir, please, You projected your own pathetic insecurity onto me," Arthur cut him off, his voice rising in volume, rattling the crystal on the nearby tables. You erased your sister's entire existence because you knew that next to her, you are nothing but an empty suit. You didn't do this to protect her. You did this to protect your own pathetic vanity. But the true devastation had not yet arrived. It came from the woman standing beside Logan. Miley Vance had not spoken a word since Arthur had recognized me. She had stood there, absorbing the shock, processing the layers of the lie. But as Sarah read the text message, I watched a profound, horrific realization wash over Miley's face. She slowly pulled her hand away from Logan's arm as if his suit jacket had suddenly caught fire. She took a step back, then another. Miley! Logan pleaded, turning to her, his voice cracking. Miley, baby, please listen to me. I just wanted tonight to be perfect. I wanted to protect you from the drama. You know my family is complicated. Complicated? Miley whispered. Her voice was shaking, but not from tears. It was shaking with absolute, unadulterated rage. She looked at him as if she were seeing a stranger wearing the skin of the man she loved. You told me she was an addict, Logan, Miley said. The words dropped into the room like an anvil. Even Arthur flinched. Sarah went perfectly still beside me. My mother let out a small, strangled gasp. I felt a cold, sharp shock radiate through my chest. An addict. Miley, don't, Logan begged, stepping toward her, reaching his hands out. Don't you dare touch me. Miley screamed, her voice tearing through the refined elegance of the country club. She pointed a trembling finger at his chest. You looked me in the eyes, in my apartment, and you told me your sister had a severe substance abuse problem. You told me she was mentally unstable. Miley turned to the room, looking at her parents, looking at Sarah, and finally looking at me. Tears of profound humiliation and anger were spilling over her eyelashes. He told me she had spent years in and out of rehab, Miley confessed, her voice thick with disgust. He told me that her brain was fried, that she couldn't hold down a real job, and that's why she did data entry from home. He told me that large crowds triggered her paranoia and that if we invited her to the engagement dinner, we had to put her in a quiet corner near an exit so she wouldn't have a public meltdown and embarrass the family. The sheer, breathtaking malice of the lie hung in the air. He hadn't just made me a clerk to avoid bragging, he had actively, maliciously assassinated my character. He had weaponized the concept of mental illness and addiction, painting himself as the tragic, supportive brother bearing the burden of a broken sibling. He had done it to elicit sympathy from Miley. He had done it to ensure she would never try to have a deep conversation with me. He had built an impenetrable wall of pity and stigma around me so that his own lies would never be discovered. Is that true, Logan? Arthur Vance asked. His voice wasn't yelling anymore. It was deadly quiet. It was the voice of a man who had the power to destroy lives and was currently deciding how to proceed. Logan was hyperventilating. He looked wildly around the room. He looked at his fraternity brothers who were staring at him with open disgust. He looked at my parents who were clinging to each other, finally realizing that their golden child was a sociopath. I exaggerated, Logan stammered, his voice a pathetic, high-pitched whine. She's always been so difficult, Mr. Vance. She's always trying to ruin things for me. I just needed a reason for Miley to keep her distance so she wouldn't sabotage the wedding. I was protecting us. You were protecting a lie, I said. It was the first time I had spoken since the explosion began. My voice was calm, clear, and utterly devoid of sympathy. I stepped out from behind the wobbly folding table and walked slowly toward him. Logan flinched as I approached, instinctively taking a step back. You have spent 38 years taking everything this family had to give, I said, looking him dead in the eyes. You took their money, you took their pride, and you took their home. I paid off your debts. I bought the house they live in because you bankrupted them. I spent my life saving people, and you spent your life using them. But this, I gestured toward Miley. This was your masterpiece, Logan. You didn't just try to hide me. You tried to turn me into a monster so you could play the hero. Logan opened his mouth, a desperate wet sound escaping his throat, but there were no words left. There were no more pivots. There were no more excuses. Every single mask he had ever worn was lying in shattered pieces on the floor right next to the broken champagne glass. He stood entirely naked in the ruins of his own making, exposed to the very people he had sacrificed his soul to impress. Miley reached for her left hand. The movement was painfully slow. Time in the dining room seemed to warp, stretching out every second into a grueling eternity. Miley reached for her left hand, her fingers wrapping around the platinum band of her engagement ring. The 3-carat diamond, a stone Logan had undoubtedly financed through a web of high-interest loans he couldn't afford, caught the light of the crystal chandelier above us. "Miley, don't," Logan whispered. It wasn't a command. It was the pathetic, broken plea of a man watching his parachute fail mid-fall. "Please, we can fix this. We can talk about this in private. Just you and me. Don't do this here." "There is no you and me, Logan," Miley said, her voice dropping into a register of cold, absolute clarity. The tears that had gathered in her eyes a moment ago were gone, replaced by the hardened resolve of a woman who had just woken up from a dangerous spell. "The man I agreed to marry doesn't exist. He never did. You are a ghost wearing a very expensive suit." With a sharp, decisive twist, she pulled the ring off her finger. She didn't throw it at him. She didn't press it into his palm. She simply walked over to the nearest table, the one where Logan's frat brothers were sitting in stunned, open-mouthed silence, and placed the ring down on the white linen tablecloth. It made a soft, heavy thud. A man who is willing to assassinate the character of his own sister, the sister who saved my mother's life, the sister who kept a roof over your parents' heads just to make himself look taller. Miley shook her head, her voice trembling with a mixture of grief and profound revulsion. "If you can do that to your own blood, Logan, what would you do to me when the cameras are off? What would you do to our children if they didn't fit your perfect manufactured image?" "I would never hurt you," Logan cried, taking a step toward her. Arthur Vance moved instantly. He didn't raise a fist, but he stepped directly into Logan's path, a towering, immovable wall of paternal fury. "Take one more step toward my daughter's son, and I will ensure you spend the rest of your life answering questions from my legal team. The engagement is over. The wedding is canceled." "Arthur, please!" The screech came from across the room. It was my mother, Julia. Unable to contain her panic a second longer, she finally broke free from my father's weak grasp and rushed into the center of the conflict. Her face was flushed, her expensive makeup beginning to run. She didn't look at Miley. She didn't look at me. She threw herself directly at Arthur Vance, her hands clasped together in a grotesque pantomime of prayer. "Mr. Vance, you cannot do this," Julia begged, her voice shrill and grating against the quiet elegance of the room. "You are overreacting. Families fight. Families are complicated. Logan is a good boy. He has a heart of gold. He was just intimidated by your wealth, that's all. He made a mistake, but you can't punish him for wanting to impress you." Arthur looked down at my mother as if she had just crawled out of a sewer. "A mistake, Mrs. Reed, is spilling wine on a tablecloth. Systematically convincing my daughter that your brilliant, life-saving daughter is a mentally unstable drug addict so he could siphon off my family's social standing is not a mistake. It is pathology." "It's Emma's fault," Julia screamed, whirling around to point an accusing, trembling finger directly at me. The entire room seemed to recoil. Even Logan, lost in his own destruction, looked at our mother with a flicker of shock. But Julia was entirely unhinged. Decades of protecting her golden child had hardwired her brain to attack anyone who threatened his success, even if the threat was the truth, and even if the target was her own flesh and blood. "She has always done this," Julia spat, the venom in her voice so pure and unfiltered it actually took my breath away. "She has always been jealous of him. She couldn't stand that he was marrying into a good family, that he was finally going to be somebody. She came here tonight specifically to ruin him. Emma, fix this. Tell Mr. Vance you exaggerated. Tell him you forgive your brother. Do it right now." I stood perfectly still. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel the familiar, crushing weight of childhood rejection that usually followed her outbursts. I just felt an overwhelming, profound pity. I was looking at a woman who had completely lost her grip on reality, a woman who would gladly watch me burn at the stake if it meant keeping her son warm. Before I could open my mouth to respond, another voice cut through the toxic air. "Do not speak to her that way." It was Eleanor Vance, Arthur's wife, the woman whose chest I had opened and whose heart I had repaired 10 years ago, stepped forward. She was a delicate woman, soft-spoken and graceful, but as she walked up to my mother, she radiated an iron core. Eleanor stopped a few feet from Julia. She looked at my mother, then glanced over at me, her eyes filled with a deep, sorrowful understanding. "I have spent the last 10 years waking up every morning, looking at my husband, and thanking God for the hands of Dr. Emma Reed," Eleanor said, her voice quiet but carrying an undeniable weight. She turned her gaze back to Julia. "I have often wondered about the family that raised such an extraordinary, selfless woman. I imagined a home filled with pride and love. To stand here tonight and witness you, to see you defend a sociopathic liar while crucifying the very daughter who holds your life together." Eleanor shook her head, a look of profound disgust crossing her elegant features. "You are a tragedy, Mrs. Reed," Eleanor stated softly. "You birthed a miracle, and you chose to worship a monster." Julia opened her mouth, her jaw working uselessly, but no sound came out. The absolute moral authority of Eleanor Vance had entirely stripped her of her weapons. My father, Ryan, finally scurried forward, grabbing Julia's arm and pulling her back, his face buried in shame. He had spent his life being a passenger to his wife's delusions, and now the vehicle had finally crashed. Arthur Vance reached out and gently placed a hand on his daughter's shoulder. "Are you ready to go, Miley?" Miley didn't look at Logan again. She looked at me. Across the ruins of the dinner party, across the shattered glass and the spilled champagne, her eyes met mine. There was no anger toward me in her gaze. There was only a tragic, exhausted gratitude. I gave her a slow, barely perceptible nod. She nodded back. "Yes," Miley said. "I want to go home." "Wait, Miley, wait! The deposits, the announcements," Logan cried out, his brain desperately trying to cling to the logistics, to the money, to the illusion of the wedding he had spent months leveraging his soul for. He took a pathetic, stumbling step forward. Arthur turned, fixing my brother with a stare that could freeze boiling water. "Do not contact my daughter ever again," Arthur commanded, his voice echoing with finality. "Do not call her. Do not write to her. If I see your face anywhere near her or anywhere near my businesses, I will make it my personal mission to ensure you never work in the city of Boston for the rest of your natural life. Do you understand me, Logan?" Logan shrank back, physically cowering under the threat. He nodded, a jerky, terrified motion. Arthur turned to me. His expression softened instantly, returning to the profound respect he had shown me earlier. "Dr. Reed, Emma, I cannot apologize enough for what you were subjected to tonight. Please call my office on Monday. Eleanor and I would love to take you to a proper dinner. Anywhere you'd like." "Thank you, Arthur," I said quietly. "I would like that very much." With that, the Vance family turned in unison. Arthur, Eleanor, and Miley walked toward the grand mahogany double doors. They didn't rush. They walked with the slow, dignified cadence of people who knew exactly who they were and exactly what they were leaving behind. The heavy doors swung shut behind them with a muffled, echoing thud. The engagement dinner was officially over, but the room was not empty. We were still surrounded by 50 guests, extended family members, Logan's frat brothers, his colleagues from the medical device company, people who had spent the last 2 hours drinking his wine and listening to his fabricated stories of grandeur. And they had all seen everything. The silence rushed back in, thicker and more oppressive than before. No one spoke. No one reached for their forks. The waiters stood frozen near the walls, unsure if they should start clearing the untouched first course or run for cover. I looked at my brother. Logan was standing alone in the center of the room. The spotlight he had so desperately craved was finally squarely on him, and it was burning him alive. He looked down at the empty space where Miley had been standing. He looked at the 3-carat ring sitting abandoned on the white tablecloth. Then, slowly, his eyes dragged up and met mine. For the first time in his life, there was no arrogance there. There was no smirking superiority, no entitled confidence. There was only the raw, naked terror of a man who realized that his entire existence had just been zeroed out. "Emma," he whispered, his voice cracking. It was the voice of a little boy who had broken a window and was begging not to be punished. I didn't answer him. I didn't need to. There were no words left to say that the universe hadn't just delivered with devastating precision. Beside me, Sarah Hayes picked up her small designer clutch. She smoothed her silk scarf and let out a soft, satisfied sigh. "Well," Sarah announced to our dark, cramped corner, her voice cheerfully slicing through the tension, "I believe we're done here. The food hasn't even arrived, and yet I feel completely full." She turned to me, her eyes sparkling with ruthless triumph. "Shall we get a drink, Dr. Reed? I know a lovely, quiet bar downtown that doesn't smell like dishwater." "Lead the way, Dr. Hayes," I replied. I didn't look at my parents. I didn't look at Logan. I turned my back on the table in the shadows, stepped out of the corner, and began walking toward the exit. As Sarah and I walked down the center aisle of the dining room, past the towering centerpieces and the shocked, silent guests, the sea of people naturally parted for us. No one tried to stop me. No one tried to speak to me. I pushed through the heavy mahogany doors, leaving the suffocating heat of the country club behind. As I stepped out into the crisp, cool Boston night air, I took a deep breath. My lungs expanded fully for what felt like the first time in 48 years. The scaffolding had finally collapsed, but I was still standing. If there is one thing you must understand about the elite circles of Boston, it is that they operate with the ruthless efficiency of a white blood cell attacking an infection. They do not shout, they do not issue public statements. They simply close ranks, and the offending organism is quietly, systematically starved of oxygen. Word of what happened at the Beacon Hill Country Club spread before the catering staff had even finished sweeping up Arthur Vance's broken champagne glass. In the world of old money, a broken engagement is merely a footnote, a temporary piece of gossip shared over tennis matches and charity luncheons. But a man who tries to marry into a billionaire dynasty by actively gaslighting his fiancée and erasing a highly respected medical titan, that is not gossip. That is a cautionary tale. It is a contagion that no one wants to be associated with. I did not have to lift a single finger to destroy my brother's life. Gravity and his own spectacular arrogance did all the work. The first domino fell exactly 4 days after the dinner. Logan had been working as a regional sales director for a high-end medical device manufacturer. He had landed the job just 6 months prior, boasting an exorbitant base salary and a massive expense account. At the time, my parents had paraded this achievement around as proof of his unmatched business acumen, but the truth, as it always does, resided in the fine print. I learned the details later from a colleague who sat on an advisory board with the CEO of Logan's company. They had not hired my brother because of his brilliant sales strategy. They had hired him because he was newly engaged to Miley Vance. The company was aggressively trying to secure a massive round of Series C funding, and they knew Arthur Vance's venture capital firm was the largest player in the healthcare sector. Logan was not an employee. He was a Trojan horse. He was hired specifically to facilitate an introduction to his future father-in-law. By Monday morning, Arthur Vance's firm had formally and very publicly withdrawn from all investment discussions with the device manufacturer. No explanation was given, but in those circles, no explanation is needed. The silence was deafening. By Tuesday afternoon, Logan was called into the Human Resources Department. Knowing that Logan was now a radioactive liability, the company immediately initiated a deep dive forensic audit into his background, the kind of audit they had conveniently skipped when they thought he was their golden ticket to the Vance fortune. It took them less than 24 hours to discover that the senior vice president title he claimed to have held at his previous tech startup was entirely fabricated. He had also lied about his sales quotas, forged a letter of recommendation, and claimed to have a master's degree he had never completed. He was fired with cause. There was no severance package. There was no quiet resignation period. He was escorted out of the glass-paneled building by security, carrying his belongings in a cardboard box, his company-issued phone and luxury leased vehicle instantly revoked. Without the six-figure salary, without the Vance's social shield, the hollow shell of Logan's life imploded with terrifying speed. The bespoke suits, the Rolex, the country club dues, the extravagant dinners he bought to impress people who didn't actually care about him, it was all built on a towering, teetering mountain of high-interest credit card debt. He had leased a luxury downtown apartment he could only afford by projecting his future earnings as Arthur Vance's son-in-law. Now the future was gone, and the creditors began calling. For 3 weeks, I heard nothing from my family. I went to work, I performed surgeries, I sat in board meetings. My life remained the steady, disciplined sanctuary I had always maintained. I knew they were in a free fall, but for the first time in my existence, I did not rush in with a net. I let them fall. Then came the second Tuesday of November. It was raining, a cold, relentless New England downpour that turned the sky the color of wet concrete. I was sitting in my office at the hospital reviewing post-operative charts when my desk phone buzzed. It was my administrative assistant, Carol. "Dr. Reed," Carol said, her voice tight with professional concern. "I am so sorry to interrupt, but your parents are down in the main lobby. Security just called up. They are causing quite a scene, insisting they need to speak with you immediately. Security is asking if they should escort them off the premises." I closed the file in front of me, pressing my fingertips to the bridge of my nose. "No, Carol, don't let security throw them out. It will just escalate. Send them up to my office, please, and hold my calls for the next 20 minutes. "Right away, doctor." 5 minutes later, my office door clicked open. I had expected them to look angry. I had expected my mother to march in with her usual fiery indignation, armed with a fresh list of ways I had ruined their lives. I had prepared myself for the shouting, but the two people who walked into my office did not look angry. They looked utterly, entirely broken. My father, Ryan, seemed to have aged 10 years in the span of 3 weeks. His shoulders were slumped, his clothes were wrinkled, and his hands were trembling visibly as he clutched a damp umbrella. My mother, Julia, was unrecognizable. The polished, haughty woman who had shrieked at Arthur Vance in the country club was gone. Her hair was frizzy from the rain, her eyes were swollen and bloodshot with dark, heavy bags beneath them, and she was clutching her purse to her chest like a life preserver. They stood in the doorway, dripping rainwater onto my immaculate carpet, looking at me with the desperate, hollow eyes of drowning sailors. "Emma," my mother whispered, her voice cracking. I did not stand up. I did not offer them a seat. I leaned back in my leather chair, folded my hands on my desk, and waited. "Emma, please," my father croaked, taking a hesitant step forward. "We didn't know where else to go. Logan won't answer his phone. He's locked himself in his apartment, and the building manager says he's being evicted at the end of the week. We are ruined, Emma." "Logan is 38 years old, Dad," I said, my voice perfectly calm, entirely devoid of the frantic empathy they had weaponized for decades. "His eviction is the natural consequence of losing a job because he lied on his resume. It is not my problem to solve." "It's not just Logan," my mother sobbed, taking a step toward my desk. The tears began to spill over her cheeks in thick, ugly tracks. "It's us. We're going to lose the house. The bank sent the final notice of foreclosure yesterday." I stared at her. The silence in the office stretched out, broken only by the sound of the rain lashing against the thick glass window. I felt my brow furrow in genuine, cold confusion. "That is impossible," I said flatly. "I bought that house for you in cash 7 years ago. I set up a trust that automatically pays the property taxes and the utilities every quarter. There is no mortgage. You own it free and clear. The bank cannot foreclose on a house that has no debt." My mother let out a jagged, hysterical wail and covered her face with her hands. She collapsed into one of the guest chairs opposite my desk, her shoulders heaving. My father looked at the floor, his face burning with a shame so profound he couldn't even lift his chin. He swallowed hard. There is a debt, Emma," my father whispered. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together in my mind with terrifying velocity. A cold, heavy stone dropped into the pit of my stomach. "What did you do?" I asked, my voice dropping to a terrifyingly quiet register. My father squeezed his eyes shut. 2 years ago, when Logan got that new job, he needed to look the part, Emma. You know how his industry is. He needed the right suits, the watch, the country club membership so he could network. He said it was an investment. He said if he could just get into those circles, he would make millions and pay us back tenfold. "So you gave him money," I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "Money you didn't have." "We didn't have cash," my mother wept through her hands, her voice muffled and pathetic. "But we had the house. The house had so much equity. Logan helped us fill out the paperwork. We took out a second mortgage, a massive one. We gave him the cash." I sat perfectly still. We took out a second mortgage. They hadn't just enabled him. They had literally cannibalized their own survival. I had bled myself dry to buy them a lifeboat so they wouldn't die on the streets when Logan bankrupted them the first time. I had handed them security, safety, and a quiet retirement. And they had taken that lifeboat, chopped it into pieces, and used the wood to build a fake throne for their golden child. "And the ring?" I asked, my voice terrifyingly devoid of emotion. "The 3-carat diamond he gave to Miley. How did he pay for that?" My father flinched. He maxed out 3 credit cards in your mother's name. She co-signed them. And the deposits for the country club. We drained our retirement accounts to cover the checks because he promised his end-of-year bonus would pay it all back. "But the bonus is gone!" my mother shrieked, dropping her hands from her face, looking at me with wild, terrified eyes. "The job is gone. He has nothing, Emma. The bank is demanding the balloon payment on the mortgage, and we don't have it. They are going to throw us out on the street next Tuesday. You have to help us. Please, Emma, you have to write a check." She reached across the desk, her grasping, desperate fingers leaving wet streaks on the polished mahogany. "We are your parents," she cried. "You make so much money. You can fix this. You can call the bank. You can pay it off. It's your duty to take care of us." I looked at her hand, inches from mine. I looked at the frantic, entitled desperation in her eyes. For 48 years, this exact look had been my kryptonite. This was the mechanism they used to extract my life force, my money, and my dignity. They broke things, and I bled to fix them. I looked at my father, who was watching me with pathetic, tear-filled eyes, waiting for me to pull out my checkbook and save them from the consequences of their own abhorrent favoritism. I felt a profound, absolute stillness wash over me. The invisible strings that had tied me to them, the desperate childhood hope that they would one day love me if I just sacrificed enough, dissolved into dust. The profound, absolute stillness that washed over me was unlike anything I had ever experienced. For my entire life, the mechanism of my family's manipulation relied on my guilt. It relied on my desperate, deeply ingrained need to be the responsible one, the savior, the daughter who would sacrifice her own flesh to mend their broken bones. But looking at my mother's grasping, wet fingers reaching across my mahogany desk, and looking at my father's cowardly, averted eyes, I felt nothing but a cool, surgical detachment. The invisible strings that had puppeted me for 48 years simply dissolved into dust. I slowly pulled my hands off the desk, folding them neatly in my lap, deliberately out of her reach. "You didn't come here to apologize for what happened at the country club," I said. My voice was no louder than a murmur, yet it seemed to echo off the walls of the office. "You didn't come here to ask how I felt when your son told the world I was a mentally unstable drug addict. You came here because the ATM is broken, and you want me to pry it open for you." My mother recoiled as if I had struck her across the face. "How can you say that? We are family. We made a mistake, yes, but we were trying to help your brother build a future. You have millions of dollars, Emma. A few $100,000 is nothing to you. It's our home." "No, Julia," I corrected her, my voice dropping to a register of pure ice. "It was my home. It was the home I bought with the money I earned standing on my feet for 14 hours a day, holding human hearts in my hands. I handed you a lifeboat so you wouldn't drown, and you took an axe to it, chopped it into firewood, and set it ablaze just to keep Logan warm." My father finally looked up, his face pale and trembling. "Emma, please." "We were stupid. We were foolish. But if you don't help us, the bank will seize everything on Tuesday. We will have nowhere to go. Logan can't help us. He's broke. He's being evicted." "Then I suggest you pack your boxes," I said simply. My mother gasped, a sharp, ragged intake of air. She stared at me, her eyes wide with a horrific realization. The ultimate threat, the guilt trip that had never, ever failed, was suddenly useless. "You would let us be thrown out on the street? Your own flesh and blood?" "You let me be thrown into the shadows by the service doors," I replied, my gaze locked onto hers, unblinking and devoid of a single ounce of pity. "You stood in a room full of Boston's elite and defended a man who tried to erase my existence. You chose your son, Julia. You have always chosen him. You bet your entire lives, your retirement, and your home on his lies. Now the casino is calling in its chips, and I am not paying your debt." "Emma!" my mother shrieked, jumping to her feet, her chair clattering backward against the glass wall of the office. "You vindictive, selfish, ungrateful wretch. I am your mother. You owe me." "I owe you nothing," I said, standing up to meet her eye to eye. "I paid my debt the day I bought that house. What you did with it afterward is your cross to bear." I reached across my desk and pressed the silver button on my intercom. "Carol," I said, my voice perfectly steady. "Yes, Dr. Reed?" My assistant answered instantly. "Please send hospital security up to my office. My parents were just leaving, and I would like them escorted out of the building. They are not to be granted access to this floor or any of my surgical wards ever again." "Understood, doctor. Security is on the way." My father let out a broken, pathetic sob, burying his face in his hands. But my mother was beyond sadness. She was consumed by the toxic, blistering rage of a narcissist who had finally lost control of her primary source of supply. "You will die alone, Emma," she screamed, pointing a shaking finger at me as two large, uniformed security guards appeared in the doorway of my office. "Do you hear me? You will have your money and your titles, but you will have no family. You are dead to us." "I have been dead to you since the day Logan was born," I replied quietly. "I am just finally returning the favor. Goodbye, Mother. Goodbye, Dad." I turned my back to them, looking out the massive glass window at the rain-swept Boston skyline. I didn't turn around when the security guards gently but firmly grabbed my mother by the arms. I didn't turn around when she screamed my name down the hallway. I didn't turn around until the heavy oak doors of my office clicked shut, sealing the silence back into the room. I stood there for a long time, watching the rain wash the city clean. I expected to feel the heavy, crushing guilt that therapists always warn you about when you cut off toxic family members, but I didn't. I just felt impossibly, beautifully light. Time is the ultimate judge, jury, and executioner. It does not care about potential. It does not care about charm. It only rewards the truth. 1 year later, the wreckage of Logan's fabricated life had settled into a permanent, miserable reality. I heard the updates not because I sought them out, but because tragedy of that magnitude tends to echo. The Tuesday after they came to my office, the bank foreclosed on the house. My parents lost everything. Their pristine suburban retirement vanished overnight. With no savings, destroyed credit, and a massive mountain of high-interest debt that Logan had fraudulently placed in their names, they were forced into a cramped 2-bedroom apartment in a noisy, run-down complex on the outskirts of the city. They did not go alone. Logan, having been evicted from his luxury penthouse and blacklisted from the entire medical sales industry in New England, had nowhere else to go. The golden child returned home. But there was no gold left. At 39 years old, a man who had once worn bespoke suits and sipped vintage champagne with billionaires was now working the evening shift at a regional cellular retail store in a strip mall. He sold phone cases and data plans to irritated customers, his slick charm having curdled into a bitter, resentful hostility. According to a distant aunt who reached out to me, the 2-bedroom apartment is a war zone. Logan blames my parents for not having more money to save him. My parents blame Logan for destroying their secure retirement. And all 3 of them, trapped in a tiny, suffocating space of their own making, blame me. They tell anyone who will listen that I am a heartless, wealthy elite who abandoned them. But their voices do not reach me anymore. They are shouting from the bottom of a well I covered up a long time ago. As for me, the year following the dinner was the most profoundly transformative of my life. Stripped of the emotional parasite that was my family, my career, and my personal life flourished with a brilliant, unhindered momentum. 3 months after the engagement dinner, Arthur Vance called my office exactly as he promised. He and Eleanor didn't just take me to dinner. They brought along the board of directors for the Vance Family Trust. Arthur had been quietly reviewing the pediatric research proposals I had been fighting to get funded for years. He didn't just approve them. He multiplied the budget by 5. By the following spring, we broke ground on a state-of-the-art facility annexed to the hospital. When Arthur and Eleanor insisted on naming it, I expected them to use the Vance family name, as was customary for their level of philanthropy. Instead, etched in massive, elegant silver lettering above the glass atrium are the words, "The Dr. Emma Reed Foundation for Pediatric Cardiovascular Excellence." On the day of the ribbon-cutting ceremony, the sun was shining brightly over Boston. The courtyard was packed with colleagues, hospital administrators, former patients whose lives I had saved, and people who had genuinely earned their place in my life. Dr. Sarah Hayes stood in the front row, raising a glass of champagne to me with a wicked, proud smile. Arthur and Eleanor Vance stood beside her. Miley, who had spent the last year healing and traveling, sent a massive arrangement of white orchids with a card that simply read, "To the woman who showed me the truth. Thank you." When it was my turn to speak, I stood at the podium and looked out at the sea of faces. My blood relatives were not there. The brother who tried to erase me was standing behind a cash register in a strip mall. The parents who enabled him were sitting in a dark apartment, mourning the illusion they had worshipped. I looked at the silver letters of my name on the building. I thought about the wobbly folding table by the kitchen doors, the cheap tea light, the black crepe dress, and the lifetime of being told to shrink myself so someone else could feel tall. I leaned into the microphone, the crisp autumn air filling my lungs. "We are often taught that family is an absolute," I told the crowd, my voice carrying clear and strong. "We are taught that loyalty is owed to the people who share our blood, regardless of how heavy they make our lives. But I have learned that true family is not an obligation. It is an action. It is found in the people who demand that you stand in the light, the people who refuse to let you make yourself small, and the people who celebrate your strength rather than fearing it." I smiled, a genuine, radiant expression of a woman entirely free. "Never apologize for the space you take up in the world," I concluded, "and never, ever let anyone convince you that your light is a threat." The applause was deafening. It wasn't the polite golf clap approval of a country club. It was the roaring, genuine ovation of people who saw me exactly for who I was. Sometimes, the most devastating revenge doesn't require shouting, plotting, or destroying someone else. Sometimes the most absolute, undeniable revenge is simply severing the anchor, rising to the surface, and letting the people who tried to drown you watch you walk on water. Thank you so much for listening to this story. We put a lot of effort into bringing you these powerful narratives about truth, boundaries, and standing up for your worth. If Emma's journey resonated with you, please hit that subscribe button, give this video a thumbs up, and let me know your thoughts in the comments. Your support helps this channel grow and allows us to keep bringing you high-quality, empowering stories every single week. Until next time, stay strong, know your value, and never let anyone put you in the shadows.